Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll give it a minute or two to let some others join before we get started. Okay. We're a couple minutes after the hour, so I think we'll get started. And then as people join, they'll join. Good afternoon again, everyone, and a big welcome to our Evidence Matters series. My name is Regina Gasicki. I am the Dissemination Associate here at the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities, otherwise known as LEO, at Notre Dame. At LEO, we match top researchers with passionate leaders in the social service sector to conduct impact evaluations that identify innovative, effective, and scalable programs that move people out of poverty permanently. The stakes are high, as we know. In the US today, over 40 million people live in poverty, and while roughly $1 trillion is spent annually to fight poverty, less than 1% is spent on evidence-based programs. So LEO seeks to bridge that gap by overlaying rigorous research, including randomized controlled trials, onto existing interventions and programs, hoping to isolate what truly works to move people out of poverty. So myself and my colleagues are super excited to have you all here today, and I want to turn it over now to Vincent Quan to introduce himself and keep us moving.
All right, thanks very much, Regina. I'm Vincent Quan. I am the acting executive director of JPAL North America, and very excited to see both familiar faces and new faces in the room today. For those of you who don't know, JPAL stands for the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and we are a research and policy center that's based within MIT. And our whole focus is simple yet ambitious, which is to reduce poverty through the use of rigorous scientific research to understand what policies and programs measurably improve the lives of people that are experiencing poverty. And very excited for the conversation that we have today. And with that, I will hand it over to Carrie to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carrie Cihak, and I've spent my career advancing equitable community outcomes in the public sector. Many of you know of me through my most recent role in King County as the Evidence and Impact Officer. And I recently left King County and I'm now working on my own. And I was struggling a little bit to figure out how I was going to introduce myself given that. But what I realized is, my passion for the role of the public sector has not changed. That's a big part of this Evidence Matters series. And I'm still just as passionate about bringing governments together with researchers and communities to support them in creating lasting, equitable impact. So I'm really excited to bring my experience in local government here to our Evidence Matters webinar series. And I'll turn it back to you, Vincent.
All right, thank you very much, Carrie. So I know some of you have joined previous Evidence Matters panels before or series before, but we thought it'd be helpful to briefly introduce what Evidence Matters is all about. So in short, Evidence Matters is a collaborative learning series that brings together folks from government, researchers, and the community on what it takes to promote rigorous learning to advance equitable, evidence-based outcomes. It started off as a partnership in 2021 between Leo and King County. They brought JPAL North America into the fold a couple of years ago, and each year we've been able to host different learning series focused on a range of topics that pertain to evidence-based policymaking and ultimately why evidence matters. And so, Regina, do you want to share a bit more about what Leo is focused on with Evidence Matters?
Yeah, I think a major part of our work in this is motivator is to share knowledge. We don't want academic research to sit on a shelf, but to be able to get out and used in communities that need information about what works to move people out of poverty. So one of the major exciting pieces of Evidence Matters is building this community and sharing knowledge with each other, not sort of gatekeeping what works and making sure that those across the country can learn from our learnings and learnings we've developed with our partners.
I think piggybacking on that point, I think all of us know that evidence-based policymaking, even though the term sounds simple, is actually quite messy and quite complicated. So Evidence Matters really is a forum for us to dig into the messy in-between real-world steps of building research partnerships that ultimately hold up and change practice. And we know that often when we focus just on the individual study, we end up paying attention exclusively to the top line result from a study. But this forum really is an opportunity for us to dig into all those nitty-gritty process details that we know are equally instrumental in getting valuable research into the field and ultimately to inform policy.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally relate to that, Vincent. And as well, I think often those of us who are doing this work in government, sometimes we're kind of doing it in isolation. It can feel like we don't have another partner in our government to do the work. So part of what we're also trying to do with Evidence Matters is build that network, connecting government staff in different places who are doing similar work, and also connecting you all with researchers, practitioners, and other people. So we're not doing it alone, that we really feel a sense of community. And so we're really going to hope to draw you out in this conversation here today.
Absolutely. So Vincent will moderate a conversation amongst our panelists today, Carrie, Patrick, and Louise, on 10 lessons learned about how governments can foster research partnerships that work, that have impact. So I'd love to turn it now to Louise and then Patrick to introduce themselves, and then I'll hand it over to Vincent to start our conversation. So Louise, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you so much. My name is Louise Geraghty. I'm the Government Partnerships Lead at JPAL North America. And my work focuses on connecting our network of affiliated academic researchers with state and local governments all across the US to generate new evidence, do new research projects, and then to find opportunities to use the evidence from research that we've generated. So I think we'll get more into the specifics about what that entails, how we approach that at JPAL North America, but really happy to be here with all of you today.
Great. And my name is Patrick Turner. I'm an assistant professor of economics at the University of Notre Dame. For the last 8 years, I've been working at Leo, building partnerships with state and local governments, with local nonprofit providers to understand what works in supporting the economic livelihood of low-income adults in the United States. I'm so excited to dig in and kind of share my experience of collaborating between academics and practitioners out in the field.
Great. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Patrick. Very excited for today's conversation. And so for today, we really will be focused on 10 lessons learned about how governments can foster research partnerships that produce real-world impact. And the focus today will be for government staff who are seeking high-quality partnerships with researchers. But with that said, we also think that many of the researchers in the audience will gain from hearing directly from governments about their perspectives, their incentives, their challenges, and what opportunities they see to form these types of partnerships. And so we really encourage a lively discussion today and also encourage folks in the audience to share questions directly in the Zoom chat. And we will try to get to as many of these as possible. We want to acknowledge that this conversation actually stemmed from a different session that Carrie and Louise had hosted at Results for America's Government Results Network. And we thought it was such a lively conversation and so relevant to many folks who are working in government that we decided it would be a perfect conversation topic for Evidence Matters as well. And Carrie, do you want to share a bit more about the Results Network for RFA?
Yeah, really encourage anyone on the call here who is with working for a government to join the Results Network. It's a community and a resource hub that's specific for people in government to support you in using data and evidence to tackle your community's biggest challenges. So it's a great place to connect with others who are doing the work. And we've got a link in the chat for you to sign up.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carrie. And plugging again, RFA. They are a great resource and great organization to check out. Okay, so we want to keep this as interactive as possible. So what we are going to do now is actually offer for folks in the audience to spend a few minutes reading through the 10 lessons that we've compiled, and then think about which one of these lessons you'd like to most focus our time together on. And in a few minutes, we will ask folks to fill out a poll ranking the top lesson you want to focus on, and we'll make sure that the panelists today share some key takeaways related to the topics. So let's give folks a few minutes to read through some of the lessons learned.
There's also a link in the chat with you can access the 10 lessons on Carrie's website to read through those on your own as well.
Let's give folks 2 more minutes to skim it through. Okay, are folks feeling pretty good? All right. Well, let's pull up the poll then. Here is a QR code that will link to a Menti site where you can vote for which topic you want to most discuss. And if there are other topics or lessons learned that have not been included in this list of 10, we also encourage folks to share ideas in the Zoom chat.
Also, a link in the chat to the Menti poll. We'll give it a minute.
And panelists, you can also fill out the Menti poll if there are specific topics you want to talk about.
I'm so excited to see what people are choosing.
Well, here we go.
Okay, looks like policy and program decisions must drive research aims is currently in the lead. 33 of 42 responded. Let's see if one of the other topics ends up catching up. Be prepared to embrace negative and null results. Okay.
hmm
We should have done some predictive betting.
Yes,
I
yes.
know, I feel like I'm on a horse race.
Next time.
Yeah.
Okay. Timing is not everything. Nurture continuous and rigorous learning. Okay, I'm seeing the negative and null
Ooh,
results one starting to catch up.
Okay.
nice. Interesting. It's a bit different than what we saw in our previous
Mhm.
conversation, I think,
Yes,
Louise.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely encourage everyone to put questions in the chat too if you have like specific aspects of these you want to dig into, or there's something here that's missing.
Okay, maybe we'll give it a few more seconds and then we can dive right into
Mhm.
the conversation. But I think we'll definitely want to start off talking about how policy and program decisions must drive research aims, since that one seems to be in the lead. I'd like to see this poll as ranked voting. Yes. Right, and one more for negative and null results. Okay, well, why don't we get started then? So it seems like folks are really interested in hearing more about how to design research projects that ultimately center a government's policy objectives, really helping to inform an actionable policy decision. So, Carrie, maybe I can start with you as a person who's worked in government for a long time, playing an evaluation role. How do you think about designing and partnering on research projects that ultimately answer the question that the government is interested in answering? And then Patrick and Louise, afterwards, I'd love to hear your perspectives as folks that work for academic research centers about how you design research studies to meet the policy objectives of your government partners. But Carrie, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, happy to. So I do think this is one of the most important lessons on the list. If you're not really staying true to answering a question that your government needs information on to move decision making forward, you can spend a lot of time in a partnership that's not producing useful results for you. And, it's really easy to get kind of moved off track. We have lots and lots of questions as government staff about how our, work is effective or not. And researchers have even more questions than we do. And so we really want to try to focus in on the kind of key question about a program that you're implementing that is going to drive a next step in decision making. Now, a lot of times, I think we kind of start or become interested in doing a research project as a government without having that question really well formulated. And that's okay. There are resources out there to help with that. I will put a plug in for JPAL. and some of the technical assistance and funding they've actually provided that really helps governments before they get into a research partnership to really think through what's the objective? What am I trying to answer? What is my theory of change? You want to know what outcome you're trying to affect, what your intervention is, and then how are you getting from A to B in moving from what you're doing to the results that you're seeking. And that's really going to help you formulate what that research question is. And you can then do that also in partnership with a researcher. You just want to make sure that as you're going through those conversations, you're always coming back to, taking a step back, get up on the balcony, try to make sure that the question you're tackling is really related to what you're trying to achieve.
That's really helpful, Carrie. Thank you for sharing that perspective. Patrick, love to hear from you as a person who's worked closely with governments on these types of research projects. How do you think about ensuring that a research project is actually informing concrete policy decisions? And what do you like to see from government partners to make sure that you also are understanding what their policy objectives are?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, a lot of the times when we're starting kind of the early stage process of working with a new research partner, they have a program that they're running in mind and they want to know what the impact of that particular program is. It's helpful. I liked how Carrie was talking about how, having questions that where the answer provides like an actionable step for the organization, right? Is it, what would it mean for this program to demonstrate success, and then targeting the research question towards that. Um, as a researcher, I'm interested in kind of answering novel questions that might extend beyond the particular life of the organization. What can we say more broadly about how a particular program works, or how individuals interact with that type of a program on a broader sense? But where there's like really good alignment between the research objectives and the agenda that the organization has, what answer would provide them with good actionable next steps, and then how that aligns with what we do or do not know from kind of the academic literature, that provides a really good launching off point for doing that. Um, Oftentimes, the partners I work with, they have an idea of what an outcome that they might care about is, and the researcher, right, if it's a good partnership, should have a good sense of like what's the best way of trying to measure that, either through administrative data, through survey data, and so it really is this co-creative process of trying to find overlap on where there's research interest on the question, and then working towards how can we best um, overlay research evidence on top of that.
That's great. Thank you, Patrick. I think your point around co-creation speaks to, I think, the importance of transparency whenever government and researchers are working with one another, being transparent about what the incentives are, being transparent about what some of the challenges are, and overall what the various policy and research objectives are. Louise, I want to hand it over to you. You're a person who thinks a lot about how to match the incentives between academic researchers within the JPAL network to those within our government partner network. So, how does JPAL think about merging these partnerships and ensuring that both parties that are coming to the table, whether or not you're a researcher or a government partner, are really approaching it on equal footing with transparency and with respect to one another?
So I think that we design our opportunities for governments to engage that really use the government priorities as a starting point for designing a research project. Some of the opportunities that we have, I think still available now, are through our learning labs for government, which offer a combination of capacity building training around evidence and evaluation for government staff members. And then eventually matchmaking with researchers within our network who share similar research priorities to what our government partners are looking to conduct evaluations on. Our staff provide a combination of technical supports, including the theory of change, which Carrie mentioned, as well as a number of other principles related to designing an impact evaluation. And governments are able to use that to kind of further develop their research questions and the logistical plan for implementation. And then we eventually look at our network, think about who is kind of interested in similar questions to what this government is interested in doing, and find folks who are able to work together is the ultimate goal. We're also able to do that on more of an ad hoc basis. We'll occasionally get requests from governments who've worked with us before in this way on other topics, and we're able to provide some matchmaking support through other mechanisms as well.
Great. Thank you, Louise. Carrie, one thing that you have shared with me before is how folks in government that are working on these research projects should really consider themselves a core and necessary part of the research team, and that folks within government bring a perspective that is so foundational and instrumental to the success of a research project. Can you share a bit more about what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times as government staff, we look to researchers as the experts in the room, and researchers certainly do bring certain kinds of expertise. But I really want to encourage, everyone who is here from government to think of themselves as researchers too. It's part of human nature to be problem solvers, and that's really what research is all about. And you hold a ton of expertise that is really critical to any research project being successful. So you have really deep program expertise. You understand decision making and other processes and how information gets used within your organization. You know the pitfalls that you have to avoid and what's feasible and what's not. You wouldn't be in your position in government if you didn't really know how to kind of work the organization to take information and turn it into action. And the most important thing that you're bringing is that you really know what the most important questions are. And that's kind of the most important part of the research process, which is what we started out talking about. So again, really think of yourself as a researcher. This is, to be a successful research partnership, you can't just come to a research organization or a researcher and say, here's the question I have, expect them to go away for 6 months and come back with an answer. It doesn't work that way at all. You have to be in the game. You have to feel like you own the research because you do, and that you're really part of the team.
Definitely want to double click on that, Carrie. And Patrick and Louise would love to hear any concrete examples you have of research partnerships you both have led with government, where having the government partner really being an equal player and truly a researcher on the team help shape some critical research design considerations you had, or fundamentally how you decided to tackle the question.
Yeah, I would just tackle kind of like two pieces there. Carrie was exactly right. One other piece that I think the partner has expertise in that the researchers don't is the populations that they're serving, right? They're working closely in line with these folks. And so whenever we're designing a research study, we take very seriously what the how that experience, how the study participants will experience their interaction with the research process. And we really heavily rely on our partners for helping us understand how consent forms, how any sort of randomization process or other data collection activities will be experienced by partners, by the study participants when we're designing these things. A couple tangible examples. So this isn't with a government partner, but with one of my nonprofit partners. They were working in a community in North Nashville, Tennessee. The primary study participant in that population is a Black woman, and the two researchers on the team that we're helping out with this partnership are kind of white men. And so, we heavily relied on our research partners for designing consent forms for how we were going to describe the study, et cetera, and what are the relevant questions that we care about for this population. We relied on them when thinking about what questions to ask in the follow-up survey that would measure what we were hoping to get at with the research study. because of their intimate knowledge of what the program was. Another example with one of our research partners, we were in early stages of designing a randomized controlled trial of a subsidized employment program, and one of our partners in the Larimore County Workforce Center had been running the program already for a year and a half. And so we heavily relied on his programmatic experience of that program for thinking about how could we design baseline survey questions to try to tease out mechanisms to try to understand who might benefit most from this program and how could we measure that as a part of this research study. And then, ex post, when we go to analyze the results, we can go back and rely on their experience on the ground for trying to understand a more nuanced perspective when we're looking at our results afterwards.
Vincent, I'd love to jump on that point that Patrick made about having diversity on your team. It's really important that you have folks on your team who have knowledge and connection and lived experience with relation to the community that you are working to serve. That perspective is invaluable, and we can talk a little bit more about that probably if we tackle some of the point about community connections. But I just wanted to underscore that point about having a diverse team.
Yes, Carrie, definitely let's put a pin on that too. I'm seeing a comment here from Mary that very much relates to the piece about community perspectives and making sure that they are represented in a research project if the aim is ultimately to improve lives of people experiencing poverty. Louise, do you have any other examples that you would like to share from the JPAL repository?
Sure. So I'm thinking of a project related to housing stability where a county government and the research team were interested in evaluating the impact of eviction prevention workshops. And there were a number of questions that came up related to the overall program design and how to best reach the community, which the government partner as well as their nonprofit partners were able to answer really effectively. The research team, of course, never would have been able to do that just by themselves. And then I think also some key pieces related to timing of the workshops, which again, kind of a program design question, but also related to data collection. Sort of what are the best opportunities for data collection? How can we reach the community? Kind of what are going to be what do we think the most effective channels will be, and the most effective approaches to be able to get the data we need to answer our research questions.
Those are really helpful examples. Thank you, Louise. And I think the key point here really is that government leaders and government staff are equal partners in this research process, and your perspectives about the program, your insights into what questions are most important to answer are really foundational to the success of any research project. So we certainly encourage folks to be really forthcoming and to lean into your own expertise and to be really confident in your own expertise. And we cannot emphasize that more. So switching gears, I know the second topic that was upvoted was the one about null results or negative results. And one thing that we have often heard from our government and nonprofit partners is that it can be really scary to participate in an evaluation if the evaluation results end up showing that there's a null result or a negative result. I think every person who works on a program, whether or not you're in government or nonprofit or philanthropy, you really believe in that program and you're working on that program because you really believe it will make a difference in the lives of people that you are trying to serve. So this fear of null and negative results is very, very understandable. Carrie, maybe starting off with you as a person who actually worked on many evaluations from the government perspective, how have you thought about null results and what are some of your responses to those types of fears that people have?
Yes. Yeah, those fears are totally understandable. And I also want to encourage everybody to think of null results as a gift. They are the most important results that we can have because the last thing that we want to do as a government or a service provider is be providing a service that isn't working, or even worse, might be producing harm. And so typically, a lot of the fear comes from thinking that you're evaluating a program or an intervention as a whole. And when that null result comes in, that means that program goes away. And we really have to get beyond that 0-1 thinking. What we need to do when we get a null result is really dig in and understand, okay, what's not working? If we went into a well-designed research project, we had a really strong theory of change that we were testing. And if we've done work in the community and we've really kind of tested out that theory of change, we should have some belief that that theory of change is valid. And so there may be some other thing that's happening that is creating a null result that we can easily fix within that program and within that existing theory of change. So I'll give you a quick example. In a large northwestern county where I used to work, we were running a homelessness a homelessness prevention program, and what we really wanted to test was whether case management, in addition to rapid financial assessment, would help prevent people from falling into homelessness. And we wanted to test that case management piece because it's very expensive to provide, it's very difficult to implement. And so if it's not having an effect, then we didn't want to invest in that. So we we did an RCT on this, and we actually found that the case management was not having an impact. And in fact, it was doing some harm in some cases. Now, what was wonderful about getting that result is we had a research team. It was a research team at Leo, and I believe that JPAL had funded part of this project. We really dug into trying to understand what was going on, and we were able to uncover the factors that were leading to that null result. So one factor was that we had a lot of turnover in case managers, and so families were not experiencing consistent provision of services from those folks. In addition, we had set up the processes in such a way that the case management was really kind of standing as like a gatekeeper to people accessing the financial assistance. And so when we solved those issues, we were able to address the underlying concerns and then go back and create a program that was actually very effective in keeping people out of homelessness. So it's not a 0-1, this program works, this program doesn't. It's about really unpacking, doing the deep learning to understand what's going on with how you're implementing something and then making the necessary changes so that it's actually working for people.
Carrie, I think that's exactly right. I think at JPAL, we often encourage folks not to frame it around does it work or does it not work, but rather focus on what can we learn about how the program is working and really treating in evaluation, whether or not it's an RCT or another form of impact evaluation, as a step in the learning journey to understand how is this program actually working in practice. And so, Patrick and Louise, I think with that, I'd love to turn it over to you to share a bit more about what you think government partners can learn in the process of doing an evaluation. To Carrie's point earlier, sometimes we can so focus on that final top line result and over anchor on a null result or a negative result or a positive result. But we actually know that some of the best learnings are from the process of partnering on an evaluation. So I'd love to have the two of you share a bit about what you think governments can learn during that process of an impact evaluation.
Yeah, I would just add, along the, as a process of setting up a research evaluation, sometimes we need to track particular things in data. And so some of my best research partnerships with governments, during the process of standing up the RCT, they've redesigned or rebuilt or added fields to their already great data systems to allow us to track things along the way. And so I think that's one benefit that comes with research is thinking about how do they track data about study participants or their program participants more generally, and that allows them to kind of have better, richer data going forward. One of the things, lesson 7, right, is this nurturing continuous and rigorous learning. One of the things I've seen along the way is, if maybe we're trying to measure something a year or 2 years after somebody participated in the program, but as a process of the RCT, we kind of set up a real-time tracking of how program implementation is going. Maybe it's a emergency rental assistance program, and we can track, okay, from when somebody calls in, how quickly are they getting their emergency rental assistance? And if that's not being delivered in the way in which the program was intended, we can catch those kind of learnings earlier. How can we better implement what's already going on? So we're testing the best version of the program.
That's great. And Louise, anything to add there?
Yeah, really also want to appreciate Anne's comment here in the chat about what's working for whom and under what circumstances, and would echo all of Carrie's points about null results being an opportunity to revisit your theory of change. If you didn't get the outcome that you were expecting after putting in, all this sort of strategic work, why is that? Could it be that you need to think about targeting a slightly different population? Make changes to the intervention to really achieve the outcome that you were hoping for. I think this is also an opportunity to continue engage governments as part of the research team and thinking about, if we have some ideas about what needs to be adjusted to the theory of change, how can we then think about testing some of those ideas in kind of subsequent research, which hopefully you're able to do in establishing a good research partnership. So I'm thinking, Vincent, of the messaging around JPAL North America's evaluation of the healthcare hotspotting program in Camden, New Jersey, which was led by our scientific director, Amy Finkelstein. They didn't get the results that they were expecting as a result of their intervention, and have gone on to do some follow-up work to kind of unpack, what are some of the reasons for that.
That's really helpful. I think one other thing that I'll mention is the importance and value of long-term research partnerships to be able to dig into these questions further. I know that King County and Leo have had a very long-standing partnership where it's not just a one and done evaluation, but really a continuous learning journey where they can continue tackling some of these questions together. For example, if you found null results the first time around, why was that the case? Or is this intervention working more for a specific population than another population? Or if you're thinking about expanding a given program or adding another programmatic component, how might that ultimately affect the results that we see? And we do think that these types of long-term partnerships are so valuable, also in part because it takes a lot of time to set these types of research partnerships up. There's a lot of rapport building and alignment of incentives that needs to happen on the front end. And when you find a good match, that's something that we actively encourage folks to really nurture and can continue cultivating so it can be a long-term research partnership to answer mutually beneficial questions. Yes, and thank you, Lena, for sharing some of those additional resources there. Okay, on that point, I know, Carrie, one of your key lessons is that timing is not everything, and that especially with these types of research partnerships, it can be very challenging to actually adhere to a specific timeline. Policy windows might change, policy challenges might change, research can often take longer than expected. Navigating data use agreements can take a very long time. Tell us a little bit more about what you mean when you say timing is not everything.
Yeah, undertaking a real research project that's a partnership does involve a large investment of time. And even when you start with a seemingly quite simple question, you should expect it's going to take at least twice as long as you think it will. That's just the nature of it. And that's why some of these other points about learning along the way, fostering long-term partnerships are really, really important. I saw Courtney's comment in the chat about how often, elected leadership or others are really looking to do research to sort of say this thing works, it's solving homelessness or it's moving people out of poverty. I understand the desire for that, and to invest the time into the kinds of research partnerships we're talking about here, we really have to have deeper aims than that. If we're looking to enter into a research project just to kind of prove what we're doing is working, and we want to do that by a next legislative body vote, we're probably not going to have a very successful research partnership. Um, so I think we really have to be cognizant of that, understand that, the goal in these kinds of partnerships is really to do that deep learning that's going to create change. It's not about proving something existing already works.
Yes, that's very helpful framing, and I think something that we definitely would second at JPAL as well. I know that timing can sometimes be considered a barrier. Another barrier that we also hear from our government partners is related to procurement, contracting, securing the necessary resources to get an evaluation off the ground. Louise and Carrie, so the next question is for the both of you. Carrie, as a person who used to work within government, how have you been able to address some of those challenges related to contracting and procurement or securing resources to get an evaluation off the ground? And then, Louise, I'd love to also have you share more about the role that organizations like JPAL can play in funding different research partnerships. So, Carrie, let's start off with you and then hand it to you.
Yeah. This is a very boring and very critically important question. So, our typical government contracting processes aren't really set up for the kinds of partnerships that we're talking about here today, where we're really trying to, often a government contracting process is about the government stepping back, understanding exactly what the scope of work is, releasing an RFP, doing a competitive process. We own all the intellectual property, et cetera, and so forth. In the kinds of research partnerships we're talking about here, we often don't really know what the scope of the project is until we're in some significant conversations with researchers. And finding the right fit between, your question as government and who the research partner you want to work with is not something that's very conducive to doing a typical competitive procurement process. And that's why we've really, in King County, we really relied on JPAL, who is essentially, you have a very large network of researchers, and you're essentially kind of screening researchers and creating that competitive process on our behalf, and then recommending matches for us. Um, I think it's really, the typical barriers that I found in trying to develop the financial or the contracting mechanisms. A big one is around intellectual property. This is the thing that researchers care about most, is their intellectual property. As a government, we typically want to own the intellectual property related to a project. I think we need to think about this in a different way as governments. Part of what we are trying to purchase from a researcher in a project like this is their independence. And so I think we can make the case within government that us not actually owning the intellectual property is also in the government's interests. But that's a barrier that can be hard to get through in our processes. So one of the things that I have found is that it's often helpful if you can first of all, start by getting matched through, an organization like JPAL to a researcher. And then if you can develop a scope of work that you can go out for grant funding for, governments are very used to developing contracts for grant funding that adopt the conditions of the grant. And in these kinds of research projects, that usually includes all of the IP provisions and other things like that. So that's been a really helpful way I found to get started. Also, don't try to reinvent the wheel. Like a lot of governments have started these kinds of projects. We've figured out how to get through the intellectual property questions, the indemnification questions, the data sharing questions. There are examples out there that you can lean on So, reach out to your colleagues. You can reach out to me, other colleagues through the Results Network at RFA for some guidance on working through that. It is a big barrier, and it does take some persistence to work through it.
Very helpful, Carrie. Louise, so over to you to talk about how some of these projects get funded.
Sure. I can talk a little bit about our model and the way that we approach funding research projects. So we raise philanthropic funding to be able to support the work that the researchers in our network do and that our government partners are working on together. We run RFPs through our research funding initiatives, which our researchers kind of lead the charge on developing the applications for in partnership with the government or a nonprofit or another agency. And that's how we find the resources to support that. I think it's not our expectation that a government is paying money for these evaluation services, and more that we will, find the philanthropic money separately to be able to support the work.
Very helpful. Thank you, Louise. And Patrick, I think that Leo uses a similar model as well, where you partner with governments, but then are able to also raise your own funding to support those research projects. Is there anything else you want to share on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just piggyback a little bit on what Carrie was saying around intellectual property, right? Like the university pays me and pays academic researchers more generally to do this type of research. And so we're not looking to fund our own time. The benefit that we get, the incentives that we have then are to go and publish these studies in academic journals. And so it's kind of this nice exchange where we can provide research services at no cost to a government agency or a partner more broadly, and kind of the exchange that we get then is the possibility of publishing these results. And so getting that data sharing agreement right is really important from our perspective. Leo, more generally, when we go to provide research, we have to pay our RAs, and oftentimes there's data collection. As a lab, we commit to covering all of the research costs that are related to this. We go to nice funders like JPAL and others then to kind of backfill. But we don't expect our research partners at Leo to pay for any of this research. We do it. And, we cover the research costs, and they're covering program costs typically.
One thing I might add, Vincent, is that even though often there's not an exchange of funds from the government to the researcher for these kinds of projects, so it doesn't necessarily require a contract. It's always a good idea to set out some kind of like memorandum of expectations or understanding that help guide the project. So I think that's always a good practice.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing that, Carrie. Okay, one more question before we hand it over to the audience. I do want to circle back on the point related to community engagement. So, as government, you ultimately are accountable and should be responsive to the needs of the community. But at the same time, we know that even between government and community members, there can sometimes be mistrust and not necessarily even the strongest relationship. So, Carrie, curious to hear from your perspective as a person who has worked within government before. What steps have you taken to make sure that any research project is ultimately responsive to the needs of the community?
Yeah, this is an important question, consideration, and one that I feel strongly about in terms of, the durable relationship between the community is between the community and the government. And if you're starting a research project, I'm definitely encouraging you to have community engagement and participation. You cannot devolve that responsibility to the research partner. Research partners are often not trained or don't have the relationships to undertake that. And again, I really feel strongly that that's our responsibility as government to remain in the lead of those relationships. Um, some things that you can think about are, all the stages of the program design and research process, from designing outcomes to the program and research design implementation, dissemination of results. All of those different stages have opportunities where you can engage members of the community. Try to think about what those opportunities are. Of course, you have to balance that with what's practical and possible. Um, it's not likely to be like a big public meeting, right? This is a place where some creativity is very helpful. So think about, are you working with a group of service providers who you could bring in at key points? I think Mary put an example in the chat earlier about bringing together some community groups to help inform different stages of the process. Can you start with some deep data dives with communities? Do you want to add a qualitative researcher onto your team to do things like surveys? And throughout this process, it's really important that you intentionally think about the equity considerations. As Anne said, what's working for whom under what circumstances. You will miss very important opportunities for ensuring your work achieves the outcome you intend if you do not think about equity from the outset. So, who are the populations who are most in need? And who are the ones who are least likely to benefit unless you really think through how to design the work in ways that is easily accessible for them? And then how are you going to begin to engage with those communities? And very importantly, what are you willing to do differently to incorporate their input into what you're doing? So there's way more here than we have time to dive into. We could do an entire evidence matters session on this, but thinking about translation, and please not through AI. It gets things wrong all the time. Outreach through trusted partners, offering compensation to community members, things like childcare, food, those kinds of things. Those are all things that you can do to help really get important community input into your work.
Thanks, Carrie. I think piggybacking on that point, it is so important also for the government partner to transparently communicate the needs, perspectives, and potential challenges of working on a project involving a given community. Because sometimes researchers, they might come into a new community context and sure, on paper, the research design looks good, but there may be certain political considerations that would make this project completely not feasible. Or there could be another research question that is so much more important for this community to answer. And I think circling back to the point earlier about how you as a member of government are an equal member of the research team and are a researcher yourself, we really encourage you to be very forthcoming and to really lean into your role as an equal partner in this research project, especially as a representative of the community. Because researchers, however well-intentioned they are, or however much research they've done, they often don't know and they don't have that experience and they don't have those insights. So definitely want to emphasize that point further. Okay. So I know that I've been doing a lot of talking, and we wanted to now open it up to see if there are any questions from folks in the audience. I know some folks have already shared some in the Zoom chat, but also encourage folks to go off of mute and share any questions they might have, either ones that relate to the different topics we've talked about or any other lessons learned that weren't covered in the 10 lessons.
Hey, Vincent, there was a question early on in the chat about whether researchers can initiate projects and then have the government partner with them. And I thought it would be good to address that from Rock. It's definitely possible. And I know of many cases where researchers have approached government and ended up forming really long-term partnerships on particular projects. I'm thinking particularly of the summer youth employment work in Boston, for example. It's a caution though. So I think if you are a researcher and you have a really well-defined question and you're expecting to come to government and quickly get access to data, I want to discourage you from that belief. Your government, government staff are really very busy people, and it's not easy to curate data sets and do all that's necessary to release them to a researcher. So I don't want to discourage you from initiating ideas and initiating partnerships on your own. I just want you to be prepared to put in the work that's the trust building and the relationship building that's really necessary to get a partnership off the ground. And so that involves not just bringing your idea, but really doing some deep listening and understanding what the government staff's needs are in that area, and then finding a place of mutual benefit for you to work together.
I think building on that point, Carrie, one of the reasons why we really emphasize long-term partnership building is precisely that, where so much of the determination of what is a feasible research project, what is a valuable research question, I think emerges from those long-term partnerships and those ongoing conversations. So I think our suggestion to researchers is when you are thinking about initiating a research project with a given government, really think about it as a long-term partnership, not just as a one and done RCT where you fly in, take all of the data, do the experiment, and fly out, but rather as a long-term partnership where you can co-create the research questions and co-create the research projects with the aim of ultimately answering questions that will be valuable both for the government partner and also for the researcher. So it's another double click on long-term research partnerships. Carrie, Louise, I'm sorry, Patrick, Louise, anything else that you would add to that point?
I mean, just, there are large fixed costs to start up this type of work. And so anytime you can, like you said, have that long-term partnership where you're answering multiple questions and you dig in, you find something you didn't expect and you can dig in, those longer term relationships are very, very valuable from an academic's perspective too.
And I would maybe just echo Carrie's points that I think I have seen instances where researchers have a very specific set of research questions or priorities and are looking for partners to work with. And so I've certainly seen success in that. I think it does generally sort of take longer to find those partners. And you might have some more sort of, kind of like failed attempts at trying to answer a particular research question before you get the result that you're looking for.
Great. I see a question here. Do you have any advice for tapping into the philanthropic and community networks of the nonprofit partner agency to raise resources to fund the research side of the project when the default for foundations and donors is to prioritize funding direct service over evidence-based evaluations? So I think there definitely are a large number of funders that are very interested in building evidence. JPAL is one of those funders as well, so certainly encourage folks to reach out if they're interested in potential funding opportunities. I think I would encourage folks to look for different foundations, whether or not it's groups like Arnold Ventures or the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation or the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation that really care about building evidence on a given topic area. Some foundations are very interested in specific methodologies. For example, Arnold Ventures focuses on high quality quasi-experimental and randomized control trials. Some other funders will focus more on descriptive research. So definitely think about the type of research and evaluation you're hoping to pursue and work backwards from there to figure out which funder is best suited for that specific type of research design. Patrick, Louise, Carrie, anything that you would add to that point?
I'd just add that often researchers have a connection to funding sources that we don't have as government, and vice versa. So, you might be thinking about, finding a researcher who is interested in pursuing grant funding with you. As Vincent says, there's lots of foundations out there that do want to fund research. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Balmer Group. There are many foundations out there, and even often the direct service provider, the foundations that fund direct service, they're interested in understanding the impact of their work. And so they may be interested in adding a component that focuses on the research.
And one final piece of advice there is definitely look into local foundations as well. There are many funders that are focused on a specific geography that are also interested in building evidence around what is effective within that particular community context. Okay, any other questions from the audience? I have many other questions, but want to make sure that other folks are getting their thoughts in. Or Carrie, Louise, and Patrick, any questions that the three of you have for one another that you're hoping to discuss? Okay, I will take the prerogative to ask another question then. So, Patrick, this is mainly for you. We touched on this a bit earlier about academic incentives. You've talked a bit about how publication and pursuing novel research ideas is something that is very motivating for an academic researcher. Can you share more about what the incentives are for researchers to work on a research project, and perhaps what are some common misconceptions that you've seen governments and nonprofits have when working with academic researchers?
I mean, the first misconception, and this comes from my family too, is that all I do is teach. But for most academics, kind of the primary thing that we do is we generate new evidence, new knowledge in our sphere of influence. I'm an economist, and so the primary goal of my job as an assistant professor is to publish in good economics journals, and that is ultimately what leads to my own career progression. So when I'm trying to evaluate a project, I got into this work because I wanted to use my skills to support, nonprofits, state and local governments, and understanding what works in their communities to help people out. In order to translate that into my career as an academic economist, I need to publish well. And so when I'm evaluating projects, some of the things I'll do is say, if we're evaluating a program, has that program been studied before, or is there something new that we can learn about this particular type of a program? And so while it might be, when we're evaluating at Leo whether a project is a good project, their question might be a really great question for that organization. It might provide them with actionable information. We're also trying to evaluate, does that research question provide us with more generalizable knowledge outside of a large county in Northwest US or outside of a community, whatever community we're studying that particular question. And so that's where the overlap is really good, is if it provides a good answer to their question and it lets us say something more generalizable beyond that local community. You know, when we're starting out projects, a smaller, we've talked about longer term research project, longer term partnerships. A smaller, narrower question may not be relevant for my career, but you can imagine the second question that we could get to after a first research project might be something more impactful, might provide a more, a better journal publication for an economist. Oftentimes, our lab will take on those types of projects because we see down the road the second or the third project, if this goes well, might be really allow us to answer some new questions that we don't have answers to.
Very helpful. Thank you, Patrick. Louise, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that? I know you think a lot about academic incentives as a person who has to facilitate so many of these research partnerships.
Definitely. So I would what's coming to mind for me is closely related to lesson number 3, that you are a necessary member of the research team. And it's sort of like assuming the opposite, that the researcher who's coming in is fully staffed up. Why would I, as a person working in government, need to ask questions and sort of contribute to this? When I think, exactly the opposite is true. You're the expert, your community, and the researchers that you're working with are looking to you as such. And so I think encouraging folks to ask questions of researchers. I think another challenge we often encounter are sort of kind of making assumptions about the specifics of a research design and the impact that may have on a community. So kind of depending on, in the context of a randomized evaluation, what the RCT design is, does that mean that I'm not going to be able to offer my community members this particular service? that may or may not specifically be the kind of the program that's being randomized. These are all questions that I would encourage everybody to ask, and your researchers have an incentive to find a solution and to work with you to find ultimately a research design that is operational and feasible within your context, and that will can actually be implemented. That's the goal.
Very, very helpful. Yes, definitely encourage folks within government, if you're working with a researcher, ask a lot of questions, big questions, small questions, and everything in between. I think being able to lay it out all on the table really is foundational to being able to move forward with a valuable research project.
I would just add on top of that too, right? There is one model of this world where there's an academic sitting in an office wanting to test a particular theory. That is not the model that we use at Leo. Like, from our perspective, and to Louise's point about, the partners being a key part of the research team is we think the best, most innovative solutions are developed by people who are out in the field doing this important work. And so I'm not going to come up with the right program to solve a particular problem in a local community. That's really where we leverage on the expertise and the knowledge of the people who are working out in the field.
Fantastic. I know that we are coming up on top. So, Gary, I just saw you
Oh,
unmute.
I was just gonna say that that's exactly why we have loved partnering with Leo and you, Patrick, because you bring that respect for the government expertise and for the community. So thank you.
Fantastic. So I know that we are coming up on time. This has been a really lively and energizing conversation. I want to hand it back to Regina and Carrie to share any final reflections that they have for today's Evidence Matters session before we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Vincent, and thanks everyone for participating. Um, I mean, it's just been said so many times, but for me, the real big takeaway was all sides of a project recognizing the agency and the expertise that each other is bringing. And I think Carrie at one point said something about not proving that something works, but creating change and kind of having the humility on all sides to work together in that way. And just been hearing how all of you have done that has been really heartening.
Yeah. And I was really appreciative of actually kind of demonstrating that kind of partnership here live in our webinar. So you've got someone representing, government expertise. You've got Patrick here, representing the research perspective, and Vincent and Louise, you're kind of, acting as like a policy intermediary. And so, having all of those perspectives available is what really creates a well-rounded project, and particularly when we're all actively working to bring in the perspective of community. So I appreciate having this well-rounded conversation here.
And I think bigger picture, the whole field of evidence-based policymaking really is an ecosystem of so many different types of partners, whether or not you're an academic researcher or a nonprofit leader or a government staffer. And so everybody has their role to play within the evidence-based policymaking movement, and just really encouraged again by this conversation and all of the folks that continue to be committed to using evidence to drive positive change. Okay, and so if folks are interested in a follow-up conversation, whether or not you want to discuss these topics further, or if you're interested in a specific research partnership with an academic researcher, we've included some contact information here that we can leave on the screen for a few minutes for folks to jot down. Okay. And I think for folks who need to hop off, you are also free to go. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please join us for our next Evidence Matters session, which we'll be announcing in the next couple of months. So thank you again.
Thanks, everybody. It was
Thanks,
great to see
everyone.
so many friends in the audience.